I'm really so excited to introduce everyone to our two speakers for today's writing workshop on the NSF-GRFP application. Two NSF-GRFP fellows, actually. So the first one, Morgan Elizabeth Jane. So she's a second-year PhD student at Harvard MIT studying health sciences and technology. And Cathy Amaya, a PhD candidate studying molecular biophysics and biochemistry, also the same department as I am in at Yale. And so you all should be very familiar with her, or at least with her signature at almost every GSMI email that you guys have been receiving. So yeah, you guys probably get to meet her. So Morgan, Cathy, and I actually all met up, I believe, back in like July. I want to say, and it was Morgan's idea, who, you know, she was the one who developed and wrote this really amazing extensive guide on how to craft, right, all these statement materials for the NSF-GRFP. And, you know, naturally we all thought, why not, right, make it into an interactive session. So here it is. The day has finally come. I hope you all will learn so much from this, and I truly hope you guys will be very happy and confident with your personal and research statements after all of this. So Morgan and Cathy, please take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction, Daisy. Yeah, just a little bit more about us. So my name is Morgan. I'm entering my second year now as a student in the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology program with a focus on biological engineering. I do drug delivery research in a lab at Harvard. I was awarded the GRFP last year during my first year as a graduate student in the biomedical engineering field. And I first became involved with GSMI as a graduate school mentor. And I'm really excited to present about the GRFP today.
Yeah, thanks, Daisy. So I'm Cathy. I'm starting my 5th year here at Yale in Biophysics and Biochemistry. And I applied to the GRFP only as a second-year student, and that's when I received it. And this is my 2nd year volunteering for GSMI. So yeah, I'll get us started. So just a basic refresher about what the NSF-GRFP is. So this fellowship program is to fund basic science and engineering research in science, technology, engineering, math, both in master's and PhD programs. And if you receive this fellowship, what it gives you is $34,000 in stipend per year for 3 years and some tuition allowance. Some schools will vary on how they give it to you. Sometimes schools provide additional money to your stipend when you do have the fellowship. And please check out Rocio and Gwenaelle's overview of the introduction to the NSF-GRFP webinar. They'll answer some more nitty-gritty information on the fellowship. And the basic components, again, are the personal statement, which is 3 pages, versus the research statement, which is 2 pages. And this again will reflect that the NSF-GRFP funds the person and not the project, because they do care about you as a holistic individual. Your 3 letters of recommendation, your transcripts, and any list of honors, awards, publications, and presentations. This is a place to put them. You don't want to take that space in your statements, so list everything that you can in your list of honors and awards. This is a reminder of the deadlines that are based on your field. They start in October 19th, and then the reference letter deadline for everyone is October 30th. So all your recommendation letter writers have to submit your reference letters by then. Okay, so who actually reads your application when you submit it? So most reviewers are faculty. Any individual who has a PhD in an NSF-funded field is eligible to be a reviewer, but the majority of people who sign up are faculty, and they have to read many applications in a limited amount of time. So when you submit your application, you pick a major field of study, such as engineering, life science, psychology, and your second field of study that's going to be more specific to that major field. So for example, electrical engineering. And this is going to help decide who gets your application to read. Now you can, the system does allow you to set percentages. If you want to say like 80% chemical biology, 20% biochemistry, and that will also help direct who they find to read your application. There's also a certain section for keywords. So let's say you're working on signaling proteins or RNA biochemistry, and you want to write that in those box for keywords just to better help them select who to send your statements to. And this is why you want to choose the fields that are closest to your actual project, because the words you write and the fields you pick is going to direct the statements to the reviewers that they have available. And these 3 reviewers are going to be scientifically literate in the major field at least. So not necessarily going to know your subfields in great detail. So you can assume that they know the basics, common abbreviations, general concepts of your field, but don't assume that they really know the specifics of your research or why your area of research is important. And this is going to be important, more crucial in the research statement, because you really don't want to assume that they know more than they do, or that they know just as much as you do, because you can't guarantee that they're going to be familiar or understand the importance of your research project. So what are they looking for in your application? This is the merit review criteria. First, what is the potential for your proposal to advance knowledge in your field or across various fields if you have a more interdisciplinary project? And this is going to be the intellectual merit. And then how will this project benefit society or advance desired societal outcomes? So this is going to be the broader impacts. A lot of broader impacts, as Morgan will go over in detail, can also be based on who you are as a person. But again, how your project ties into the impact on society is important. So how do these proposed activities suggest and explore creative, original, and potentially transformative concepts? So creative science comes from using existing foundations, existing knowledge that we have, and combines them to push these ideas forward. So how can you build on the science that exists to close these knowledge gaps, and specifically in the field that you're applying for? They're also going to be looking for that these proposed activities are well-reasoned, well-organized, and based on a sound rationale. So are these achievable ideas? Even though they're looking for creativity, this has to be reasonable. This has to be physically possible. So they are going to look for how you're going to make sure that you can actually achieve this. They're also looking for how well qualified are you? Have you shown creativity and persistence in other areas of your research? And what access or resources do you have to really push these ideas forward?
All right, now I'm going to discuss a little bit about the scoring process. Oftentimes you submit an application, whether it's for GRFP, graduate school, undergrad, and it sort of seems like it just goes into a cloud and then eventually it comes back and you get a decision of yes or no. I'm going to go a little bit over what actually happens during the scoring process so that you can understand a little bit more about what the reviewers are looking for. Usually each application will have about 3 reviewers. Sometimes it can be 2, usually it's 3. And they're going to score you based on the intellectual merit and broader impacts criterion. So the merit review criteria that we mentioned before are listed by the GRFP, but in terms of the official ratings, there's 1 for intellectual merit and 1 for broader impacts, and each are rated on the scale listed here: excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor. Now, what you might be asking is, what if I have a reviewer who's in a really bad mood and rates every single application as fair or poor? Do not worry, because these scores are then converted into z-scores that are normalized to the reviewer. So for each criterion, you'll get 3 scores on this scale from each of 3 reviewers. But then for the actual ranking and assignment process, they're committed to z-scores. So they're normalized for how the reviewer tends to score. So you're not penalized by ending up with a more strict reviewer. Eventually, these z-scores are then ranked. So from a list of about 13,000 applications, you end up with about 2,000 awards. This award amount does vary a little bit year to year, depending on the funding that is available. And usually they will give out honorable mention to about the same number of students that they award. I believe last year there were about 13,000 applications, but again, this can vary from year to year as well. All right, tips to consider before beginning your application. You want to read the entire document through 2 times. This is really important to make sure that you don't miss any important formatting instructions. And again, you want to follow those to the letter. There are some new rules this year regarding the formatting that you want to pay attention to, but fortunately, you can check your application within you can check your submissions within the application, which is really helpful. In terms of your letter writers, they don't all have to be from academia. Oftentimes there are other formative experiences that you have in industry, perhaps, where those letter writers can speak to your motivations as a scientist. And it might be a good idea to pick that person if another letter might not be as strong. If you're a second-year graduate student or a current graduate student, sometimes choosing a letter writer from your current institution is helpful. And it's also helpful to ask these letter writers to reference those merit criteria, the intellectual merit and broader impacts in their letters to make it much easier for the reviewers to understand. And you can do this as well in your statements by calling attention to important sentences with bold, underlined, italicized font to really make it easy for the reviewers to understand what it is that you're trying to communicate about the review criteria. All right, we are going to start now on the personal statement. So there are a couple of things that you're looking to communicate with the personal statement. The first one would be your qualifications to conduct successful research in your field of choice. So this is more or less related to how have you grown as a scientist through your past experiences as an undergraduate. What experiences have you had that motivate not only your choice to become a scientist, but your proficiency? We're going to talk about the different ways that we can communicate that. Next is your scientific and future goals. This is related to what types of scientific problems interest you. What are you curious about? And how will you eventually turn this into a scientific career? And eventually, how will this relate to broader impacts? So the impacts of your scientific work and also outreach that you may do as a scientist and citizen, how this work has a broader impact, both on your field and then on society as a whole. This ties quite nicely into these goals and motivations that you'll also want to talk about in the personal statement. So how do we go about doing this? This is a lot of information. 3 pages, single space is a lot of space. How are we going to organize it? How do we communicate it? We communicate by telling a story, and I'm sure this is something that most of us have heard at some point regarding personal statement writing for graduate school or other applications, but it really holds true here. And it's because you want to show, not just tell, how you got to where you are now. You're at a point where you're applying to graduate school, you want to become a scientist, and you wouldn't be applying for graduate school or be in graduate school or applying for the GRFP if that wasn't the case. So this is a great place to tell your story about how you arrived at that point. So how do we do this? The best way to show, not tell, is by discussing previous experiences. These are usually academic or work experiences that are related to your field of study. And you want to touch upon each one that has shaped your path as a scientist. And also, this is an important place to note that these previous experiences may not relate exactly to your future goals or what research you do now or what you want to work on in the future. And that is okay, because everything that you've done in the past has somehow shaped your story to lead you to where you are now. I think it's quite unrealistic to expect everyone to enter their freshman year of college knowing that they want to be a scientist and knowing exactly what type of research they want to do in the future. That is okay, that is not expected. However, you can frame these experiences in a way that shows your evolution as a scientist. So each experience, you want to include a couple of different components. These are the kind of the 3 core facets that we've identified for each experience that are really important to communicate. And they relate to the left column of items in many ways. So the first for each experience is a contribution. What did you contribute scientifically or technically? This reflects the qualifications that you're showing, that you're qualified to conduct research in your field. The second is takeaways. So what did you learn? How does this inform your future scientific goals and your path going forward? And then the third is impact. Again, related to broader impacts. This could be on your on the field, and usually will be for academic or research experiences. However, this is also something to consider for broader impacts, which we'll discuss a little bit later. And it's important to note that the takeaways, so what did you learn? How did this inform your path? These aspects will inform how you transition among the experiences that you describe in order to form a coherent story. And we'll go into this in a little bit more detail, but we encourage you as you write these statements with each experience that you have, think about what you learned and how that motivated you to pursue the next experience that you will talk about in your statement. So this is a brief outline of the structure that Cathy and I think is helpful in terms of writing the personal statement. It is by no means the only way to write a personal statement, and inherently there's going to be overlap between these concepts. But just as an overview, the introduction can be quite short. This is a good place to introduce who you are and a quick summary of your motivations. The bulk of the statement will be the summary of your experiences, which more or less falls under the category of intellectual merit as you describe what you've done academically in terms of research. This is the bulk of the statement. Using this as a springboard, you can talk about how that's informed your future goals as a scientist, and then finish off with broader impacts, both related to activities that you've done in the past and then what you hope to do as a scientist in the future.
Okay, so I'll start talking about how to structure your introduction. So the way the introduction for the GRFP for the personal statement is a little unique in that you can be a little more creative and start with a short anecdote or a personal story of how you became involved in your field. This personal story helps bring the reader into your world so they can see what was your spark of love of science story. And this will help show them your commitment and passion for science. And in this introduction or story, you want to also show any obstacles you've overcome to go where you are now. So one example statement to start off an introduction is listed here. So as a first-generation college student who grew up in a rural community, raised by a single mother in a lower class household, each stage of life has produced new obstacles directly related to my background. So here in a short sentence, you immediately understand a lot about the student's life. It's almost they've already brought you into their worlds and you understand, and now they'll go into a little more detail about how they overcome the obstacles that they've encountered. So in the introduction, you also want to summarize your target research area and future goals. So give away the ending. Tell them what you're going to tell them at the end. Why do you want this PhD? Or why are you pursuing this PhD? And what will you do with it? So here's an example. As a graduate student, I will leverage these experiences to work toward my overarching goal of improving the efficacy and safety of drug delivery systems. So here's a very clear, concise sentence of how you're going to use your PhD. So now we'll go into, if you had a chance to read the example statements that we sent you, we would like to ask you if you liked or disliked anything about the introductions that you saw in those examples. Feel free to type in the chat or the Q&A. I'll just give everyone a minute if you want to comment.
Also, you could pull up those statements just to reference for the future. We'll be referring back to a couple of them throughout the rest of the webinar. It might be helpful to have them on hand to follow along.
Or we can just jump into an example.
For sure. Looks like we have something else in the Q&A.
Yes, let's answer some questions in the Q&A. So the first question from anonymous attendee: do letter writers have to be in your field, or can it be an academic that mentored you in another way? Yeah, no, they definitely don't have to be in your field. It should be someone that can speak to your abilities as a scientist, as a dedicated person to the scientific community in ways also outside of science is really helpful. So usually you do want it to be like a postdoc at least, or outside of academia is also fine if your boss can speak to those qualities as well. Yeah, how do you decide whether to apply your first or second year as a graduate student. This kind of depends on how well of a research project proposal you can put together. I think as a second year, you might have a little more data, a little more grounding in your field if you're switching fields. But if you feel really comfortable and confident as a first year applying, then you should definitely go for it. Yeah, Morgan, I think you applied as a first year, right?
Yeah, I applied as a first year. And it's interesting to note that the requirements for graduate students, for second year graduate students, what's expected by the reviewers, the bar is a little bit higher. They're expecting you to have a reference letter from your PI. They're expecting you to have maybe some preliminary data, some experience with the techniques that you reference in the proposal. Whereas if you're an undergrad or a first year graduate student, that bar is a little lower. And it's also important to note that you're only compared to your cohort. So for the award process. So if you're a first year grad student, you're not being compared to second year grad students and vice versa. So it's sort of, weighing those factors to decide when is best for you to apply.
Yeah, thank you. Can you repeat so the slides will be available afterwards, so you can look back to see the way we wrote the distributions of the content in the personal statement. But yeah, the bulk of it will be the intellectual merit that Morgan will go over after the introduction. Okay, so we did have one comment that one of Mariela wrote, that she liked that one of the essays started with describing where they grew up and how it was a disadvantaged community, which she thinks is very important, as they have no other way to know the disadvantages some students come from. Yes, this is exactly the point. Some of us don't have as extensive or as much research experience. I mean, maybe that's more to the, but to show that you face these challenges and you still are doing science and you're still committed to research is really unique and really important. Okay, great. So now I guess I can jump into the introductions. So here are two short examples. Maybe I can give everyone just a couple of minutes to read them, and then we'll go over what's good and what could be improved on them. Okay, yeah, so let's go through them. So the first example, you can see it starts off with like a question. So different type of sentence structure, a little more intriguing. And then she or he, sorry, I didn't put the person's name on the statement, but then they start talking about this really unique experience that they had to use these kind of scavenger-like qualities to figure out how to demonstrate science in a new place. So it's kind of making it up as it goes, but still found it exciting, and still clearly was able to find a way to teach others about these scientific concepts. And they clearly enjoyed. They say they watch science come alive, but this has cemented their goal to pursue their PhD in biochemistry. So here you like immediately brought into their spark of love of science story. So that's really going to grab the reader's attention. And then they address how they overcame these obstacles with their passion and creativity for science, but they ultimately tie it back to the goal, that what they're going to do with a PhD, and specifically in biochemistry. So this is a great introduction. And now the next one. So again, here we start off with a very lively story. Their high school chemistry teacher jumping from the classroom talking about science. And this is how they became interested in chemistry and knew that they would want to pursue this. But they have to overcome now this obstacle of what the cultural expectations are, the financial expectations of attending college are. So here, after we start with that love of science. Now we're overcoming these financial and cultural obstacles, but they choose to do so to pursue their scientific goals and careers. But what could be improved is to tie it back to the ultimate PhD goal. They could have said, and this is what's culminated in my decision to achieve a PhD and maybe contribute to the diversity of professoriate, or just pave the way for others like themselves as well.
I would like to add, so Fabiola, bravo. So you also noted in the Q&A panel, thank you so much for responding. So you've said, I think that the first introduction summarizes an important aspect of the applicant, which reveals the initial point of view as a result of economical disadvantages. Exactly, and then that's exactly what Cathy has pointed out.
Awesome. All right, thanks, Cathy. So once you've written your fantastic introduction, the reader knows a little bit about you, they're interested in your story, and you've communicated a broad overview of your future goals, specifically as it relates to your scientific career. The next section of the personal statement is the intellectual merit. This is the meat of the statement. This is the big one, and it kind of sets the stage for the other two sections that we've identified, the future goals and the broader impact. And as we alluded to in the beginning, this section is for you to arrange descriptions of your prior experiences to tell a story. And we've sort of outlined a framework for you to do this for each experience, and that's what I'm going to go over currently. If you'd like to follow along with some of the examples, you can refer to personal statement number 2 that we sent out. This content is on the bottom of the first page of that statement. But I'll also read through some of the information to make sure that everyone gets a hold of it. So what information do you want to include for each experience, and how? You can think about it in terms of answering a couple of questions that someone was interviewing you, talking to you about the experience, they might want to know. So the first question they might ask is, why? Why did you pursue this experience? Why did you pursue this research project, this internship? Why was it this topic as opposed to, all the other labs that you might have wanted to join? So what was your motivation? And it doesn't have to be super fancy or organized. As mentioned earlier, at the beginning of your scientific career, sometimes it's, wow, this area of research sounds really cool, and the applications are kind of novel, so let's give it a try. And that's okay, and you can describe that in a way that still sounds scientifically coherent. So if you want to look at the example from personal statement number 2, in that very last paragraph at the bottom, when describing the experience, this person notes that they did a previous project that was focused on organ modeling. That was pretty interesting, and how that relates to therapeutic development. Then they also wanted to explore, that motivated them to explore the area of regenerative medicine. That's a nice transition point from experience to experience, and it gives us a motivation for pursuing this area of research. The next question you want to answer is where or with whom. This one's pretty straightforward. You can address it in a single sentence. Get it out of the way just so people know where you're working and what you're working on. In the example statement, we have this professor's tissue engineering laboratory at a certain university. Next question is framed in an interesting way, and there's a reason for that. It's a dual statement. It's a what, why. And this is to distinguish it from the first why, because it's actually quite different. So the what, why statement relates to two things. It relates to the goal of the research. That's the what. What are you trying to accomplish with this project or internship or whatever experience you were working on? What was the scientific goal? The second why relates to the rationale. So why is it important that you study this or try to accomplish whatever you're trying to accomplish with your project? One way this was outlined in the example, so this person mentions that what they're trying to do is quantify the effects of print orientation on scaffold mechanical properties. This was a 3D printing project. That's pretty clear. That's something we can measure. We know that there are different ways that we can measure the mechanical properties of materials. We want to see how they change at different orientations. So that's a pretty clear scientific description. But then you might also ask why you're going to devote all this time to a project. It must have been important for a reason. And then the second sentence to that is a follow-up with, because it's essential to understand how to optimize print parameters including orientation, such that the printed features agree with the design specifications. So that's a really nice and clear answer related to manufacturing regarding why you might want to do this. So this aspect is summarized as what, why. Sounds a little silly, but goal, rationale. Last aspect that you might want to include is how. This is when you delve a little bit more into the experimental methodology and what you actually did in the lab and contributed to the project. So a quick overview of any experimental techniques, computational methods. I developed a program. I ran these types of experiments. I surveyed the literature and I planned out this set of experiments. In the example here, we have that we used a certain additive manufacturing technique, designed scaffolds in SolidWorks, fabricated them, mechanical testing. This is kind of the meat of the project, and this helps you show those qualifications that we were talking about earlier. So you have experience working in this area, and you were able to contribute something concrete to the project. Also, important qualifier there is just because your project didn't turn out as you had hoped, or didn't achieve the end goal, does not mean that it is not worthy of including in the intellectual merit section. Because no matter what you did, you went through this research process. You identified a question, why it was important to answer the question, and you probably gained some sort of experience in the lab or with whatever other methods you're using, and that is valuable in your development as a scientist. Absolutely worth including. So from this, then in the latter part of the description of the experience, we summarize according to some of the facets that were mentioned earlier. So the first would be contributions. So this could be, this is somewhat related to what you did in the lab, but tie it all together. How did the project conclude? So maybe you know, that could be with, I concluded that type of statement, which is actually shown in this example. So this person says, I found that mechanical properties and physical features were more variable than those of scaffolds composed of a different material. It's a nice, succinct research conclusion. Other contributions, even if your project didn't work out too well, might be related to future studies in your lab. Did it result in a new project idea? Did you follow up on anything experimentally? That's still a valid contribution, even if your experiments didn't work. And in this spot, you can briefly mention any publications or awards just to let the reviewer know how what you're mentioning in that application form is associated with each experience that you had. So this can take the form of, a brief single sentence statement, and it's bolded in the example at the end of that paragraph. Oh, by the way, this led to some journal papers and some conference presentations. Reviewers really like to see the outcomes of your work, not only in terms of the scientific contributions, but also anything that was published to the greater community. Doesn't even have to be in a journal paper, it could be a conference or some other communication. And lastly, the last component that you want to think about are the takeaways. So this kind of takes us full circle, brings us back to the why statement of the next portion that you're going to discuss. So from this experience that you had, you hopefully learned something. It could be, I never want to work in this field again. And while I wouldn't suggest writing that verbatim in a statement, you can say, well, I shifted my research direction and there's this other area that was really interesting to me. So I went on ahead and did this. I wanted to learn more about X, Y, or Z. I really enjoyed this research because X, Y, or Z. And this helps frame your story. And again, takes us all the way back to the why statement that we have there. So this is a general structure that you can think about, these 6 components, when you're describing each experience in your intellectual merit section. And I would recommend even outlining it before you write the statement. Just under each section, get that basic info down and then let it flow together as you write your draft.
Oh, Morgan, so we actually have a follow-up question directly related to the intellectual merits.
Awesome.
So someone has asked, so then how would you frame failed experiments or negated hypotheses? Or if your research stalled for a long time and you didn't achieve that much by traditional standards?
Mm-hmm. I think that you can explain those things in a scientific context as best you can, and or focus more on the takeaways aspect and what you learned. So that could be experimentally, techniques that you learned that might have then advanced future research projects, or just to communicate that you're qualified to conduct research in the field that you're proposing to conduct research in. That's really helpful. And then in terms of failed results, you can communicate that kind of as is, and then hopefully someone in your lab gains something from it. If not, that's completely okay. Again, then focus more on the takeaways aspect, how that informed any future work that you did, and your motivations to become a scientist. And even this is sort of present in that first example. So more or less, there was a conclusion, and it was that the mechanical properties were more variable, which was unfortunate, right? Because this person was studying expensive commercial materials. You would hope that the in-house lab design materials would do just as well, and they didn't. However, there's still a conclusion to be made, and even if it's a negative conclusion, it's still a conclusion. You went through the scientific method, you thought about it, you learned how to do the experimental techniques, and you got a result. And you can communicate that succinctly and take up that space. And that's totally valid, especially when combined with any discussions of how that relates to your future goals.
Thank you for that question, and thank you, Morgan, for that.
Yeah. All right, so here we just have another quick example related to the 6 components that we've listed here, summarizing an experience. This is from personal statement example 1. So we're just gonna take 30 seconds to read it through. It's pretty quick. And just think to yourself about how each statement fits in with the components that we've mentioned here. It also should be mentioned that every single summary of an experience may not touch upon each of these components equally, and that's okay. It is okay to emphasize where necessary, depending on what the main aspects were. So there wasn't that as much by way of contributions, then talk more about takeaways, and vice versa. So let's take 30 seconds to try to match up some of the sentences here to the components that we've mentioned below, just on our own. All right, fantastic. Let's keep moving along. Yes, we also just wanted to open if there's anything that anyone specifically liked or disliked about the intellectual merit section in the examples, the ones that we've shown here, or the personal statement examples that you had read previously, or any other questions that you might have about intellectual merit in the personal statement. I can't see the Q&A for some reason, so.
Oh, okay. I can.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, I can read some questions for you while we wait. So Melissa asked, if the study has not come to an end yet, would you frame the contributions in future terms, such as this results from X, the results from X will help inform X and X, which would facilitate and aid X?
Yeah, that's definitely a great idea. So if there aren't results, that's okay. You can frame contributions in terms of what you did in the lab, so how you contributed to actually setting up the study or executing the study, and the potential impact on society as well. That's absolutely valid, and that sort of relates to the rationale and goals of the research. You can absolutely finish off that paragraph by tying it back to the rationale that you presented.
Okay, and there are 2 similar questions. How do you write the personal statement if you intend to change research fields between undergrad and graduate school? I'm worried that my research experience is one field, while my personal statement is about one field of research, while my research statement is about another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really fantastic question. I think you want to take as much space as possible in the personal statement to discuss your motivations for that switch. If you do have any research experience that's even tangentially related in terms of whatever you're doing technically, definitely try to emphasize that. If not, again, kind of tell your story the way that we're outlining this, and focus on the takeaways aspect. So, you probably had a couple of research experiences related to this previous field, and there's something about this other field that is drawing you in. Really focus on that as related to your previous experiences to set up the motivation for what you want to do in the future. That is totally okay. And then if there is anything at all that will, like from your research experience, whether it's technical or, I wouldn't emphasize soft skills too much, but absolutely those skills are, essential to be a scientist, and they're inherently translatable. So something like, data collection or organization, computational methods, perhaps, statistics, anything that stands out to you from your past experiences that might be translatable to your future experiences, absolutely mention that to show your qualifications.
I think also a question addressed by Summer Blanco, and I believe it also touches upon, whether on the liking or disliking about the intellectual merit in the examples. And so they've asked, it sort of centers quite a bit on the specifics of the project, right? Is it okay to talk more in detail about how this experience has impacted you personally? Kind of like, this experience allowed me to develop the confidence and communication abilities to persist in grad school.
Yes, absolutely. So we have the 4 kind of sections that help you describe the experience, and then contributions and takeaways. The takeaways are super important. This is a story that you're telling about yourself, and if without that experience you wouldn't be where you are now. It's really important to emphasize that. That shows a really strong motivation and drive to enter the current field of research that you're in. So as long as it's not at the expense of technical details, it doesn't have to be highly technical. You don't need to list every single technical skill that you learned. I would more just describe what you contributed to the project on more broad terms. If you want to review those personal statement examples, and there are plenty more online as well, to look at the depth with which people describe the technical aspects, you absolutely can balance that with the takeaways and save room for that if that's really crucial to your story.
Great question. Thank you, Morgan.
All right. Are we ready to keep going?
Yep. Yeah, so we acknowledge that we have several questions, and so we can address them also more later towards the end of the Q&A section as well. Yeah.
Okay. I think let's wrap up the personal statement section and then finish up with those questions, and then we'll move on to the research statement. Wonderful. All right. Where are we here? All right, the next section is future goals. This is a short section, but it ties in everything that you've discussed so far in the intellectual merit. You want to communicate 2 things. What do you want to contribute to your field and society? How will you accomplish this through your degree program, basically, in graduate school on your path to becoming a scientist? And you can do this. We've identified 3 main categories through which you can communicate this. So the first is by stating a broad research goal. This is going to be related to the field of study that you've identified on your application. And you want to be sort of in the middle in terms of specificity. So saying that, well, I want to do research that's related to medicine. It's perhaps too broad, but at the same time, you don't want to start getting into the details of your research proposal. You want to find something that's right in the middle. So from the example statements, we pulled out 2 succinct statements that we thought were good examples. So in the First, personal statement example. Towards the end, I think the future goals section is the very last paragraph on this statement one example, if you want to skim through that. This person mentions that their research goal is to investigate these signals that are generated by core collapse supernovae. I don't know anything about physics or astronomy, but to me, that seems like a nice focused research goal. But we're not talking about, specific aims or anything like that. Another example is designing a certain type of drug delivery strategy for therapeutic localization, and talking about the impacts of that. This is a good degree of specificity with which to discuss your research goals. And you can also you can tie this back to the motivating experiences that you had described in the intellectual merit section. The next aspect that you want to communicate is broadly your career goals. Again, if you're not sure, that is 100% okay. So two examples that we've identified are, classic teaching and research at a university. You want to become a professor, or you want to work in a different industry, and that is okay. One thing that we should note is that you do not want to have to be, you do not have to want to be a professor in order to be awarded this fellowship. The NSF funds future scientists, and scientists work in all areas of society, not just at universities. They work for government agencies, for hospitals, and in the industry, in all kinds of roles. And it would be quite limiting to limit this award only to, potential professors who may not have even finished undergrad yet and are still working out where they might go to grad school or what type of research they want to do. So be honest about what you want to do in the future, and should relate to your research goals in one way or another. And the last aspect is societal impact. This can be tied to your research goals. Describe quite broadly how you will use this position to impact society. So some examples that we had, so related to this drug delivery example, well, why do I want to do this research? Why do I want to work in this scientific field? Because I want to enhance both the applicability and safety of a certain type of therapeutic. It's a nice broad societal goal. These also can be related to mentorship and outreach. So the other personal statement mentioned mentorship as being really important. So they wanted to nurture the next generation of scientists. And since they want to have a teaching position at a university, that connection is apparent. Likewise with the pharmaceutical R&D, safety of therapeutics connection. You can see how it kind of all comes together into kind of a coherent expression of what do you want to do in the future. And finally, broader impacts. You can't forget about broader impacts. It's super important. Technically on your scoring criteria, counts for half of how you'll be evaluated, which is why in the outline we said we take about 35 or 40% for broader impacts. So you want to answer these questions. So in your experience so far, in college or whatever else you've done, have you taken on an active role in the community, both directly in the scientific community and the community at large around you at your university? And then how do these experiences shape your future outreach goals, potentially career goals, and the potential impact? So we've sort of identified 3 categories that may be helpful for you to think about broader impacts and how you frame the statement. The first category is broader impacts related to your research goals. And in the future goals section, we've already touched on this a little bit. You kind of mentioned some societal impact there. So impacts of your past and future projects on society. You can mention these here, but we recommend reserving them for the research statement actually, for the most part. You want to take this part of the personal statement to discuss more about any outreach activities that you've done. So these are your previous experiences, and they're pretty all-encompassing. There are lots of things that count here as being engaged in your community. Mentorship of any kind, volunteering in the local community, activism, leadership positions that you've had in clubs, other local organizations. Were you a TA? Are you involved as a science communicator? Having a blog about science or your life as an undergrad even does count as an impact experience, as a broader impact experience. So like the intellectual merit, we have these experiences that we've had, we want to describe them. We can frame them again in terms of takeaways and impact. So impact is, what impact were you trying to have on your community, or did you have on your community through these experiences? And then the takeaways, what did you learn about either the community that you were working with or what you want to do in the future, which paints a really nice path to your future goals, your future outreach activities. And from there, you can lead into some planning that you might have for further outreach or engagement that you want to work on in graduate school. So again, we sort of have a nice little flow chart that we're following as we kind of talk about how we describe our impacts. So yeah, takeaways, impact to future goals. We have a couple of examples here. I don't want to take up too much time, so I'm going to actually pop them all up right here and give everyone a little bit of time to read all of them and think about how they fall into each category.
We actually have a question about the broader impact section.
Sure.
So how can you address lack of leadership or mentorship? As an immigrant student whose first language is not English, I was never able to think of myself as a mentor. So I feel like I lack this kind of leadership.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I think that leadership is only one way of many that you can have an impact. So you don't have to have necessarily a designated leadership position in an organization to be a leader. So there are different ways to do this depending on what activities you've engaged in, whether or not you volunteered, perhaps you were a member of other clubs that might have done some work in the community. You can mention that and mention your contributions, even if you didn't have a particular leadership position or a particular role related to organizing those activities. You can also talk about how your background might have inspired you, right? So if at the beginning, maybe you weren't feeling very self-assured about it, and now you're sort of thinking ahead to your future in graduate school, has this prompted you to think about mentoring students who might be like you, for example? So if that's something that you want to talk about as a future plan, you actually have a pretty strong backing for that because you've lived through it, you know what it's like, and that's a very strong motivation to pursue that type of work in the future potentially. So you can also describe your personal motivations, even if it's not necessarily backed by like, oh, I held this position in this club or something like that, for sure.
Yeah,
do you guys anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I'd like to also add that maybe if you were also had to have a job to support yourself, that's also very leadership-like because it's a lot of responsibility to do that. Leadership doesn't always mean being the leader or being the head of the team, but being there, like present, is often a really strong sign of leadership, and supporting others is a really strong sign of leadership as well. I forgot, but yeah, there is also related to that broader impacts also is another question that says, can we talk about systemic barriers and a desire to reimagine the structure of academia and how to create more access, or is that too much for reviewers? Like wanting to become a professor and be part of committees that implement holistic review, implementing programs, community spaces to change institutional culture. This is exactly what you should, you can totally talk about.
Please talk about it, especially, clearly that's something you've given some thought to and are motivated to engage in. Absolutely, full steam ahead. I think, most people at this point are, acknowledging some of those systemic problems in academia. And that's your future goal. You want to be there and you want to be actively involved. Yeah, absolutely.
And related to that, can we talk about more than mentoring K-12 outreach, like bigger picture issues? I think we need a little more detail for that. Oh, you mean like K-12 outreach as, yeah, we might need a little more detail to answer that question.
Yeah, agreed.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I think we should move on forward, and then we can address all of your other many great questions towards the end of the webinar.
Sure, yeah, I have one more slide, I think, about broader impacts, and then we're going to get into the research statements. We can move right through once we answer those questions. Oh no, wrong way. Actually, no, perfect. We're right on the research statement. All right, awesome, right on time. All right, so we're done with the personal statement. We're gonna move on to discussing the research statement. This document is, fundamentally different in a lot of ways. And there are some different things that you want to communicate. Overall, at this point, you want to show that you are capable of thinking like a scientist. 2 pages is not very long, but you can structure it such that you have a logical flow of ideas and a rationale to communicate your scientific capabilities. So what do you want to include in the research statement as a high-level overview? You want to identify a research question or a problem. You need a question that is worth answering. Perhaps there's something unknown in the literature or a disease that needs a better treatment, etc. You want to identify and thoroughly describe this research question or problem. You're going to design a coherent, realistic plan to answer the question or solve the problem. This is something that should be able to be accomplished throughout the course of a PhD or master's, whatever you're applying for, something that you can accomplish with those resources that are available to you. So that's important to keep in mind when you're designing your plan. You don't want to have super broad out there goals. It should be something that is achievable, but still novel and adds something of value to the field. Perfect transition. You want to prove that this research is novel and creative, and it has the potential to impact the field and society. And, all these concepts more or less, are tied into one another in some way. A couple of tips to get started. Browse, review articles to identify knowledge gaps. This phase might take a while, and that's okay, because at the very beginning, you want to make sure that the problem you're addressing is a real problem in the field. So devote your time to browsing the literature and identifying those knowledge gaps. And then dedicate a lot of time to the brainstorming phase. This is probably the longest phase of the whole process, at least in my experience. I don't know if it was the same for you guys, but this takes a lot of time, and there are a lot of ideas that you're just going to have to scratch, and you might have to start back again at square one. That is 100% okay. Just getting started and brainstorming ideas is often the hardest part of this whole thing. And then finally, once you've kind of gone through this cycle a little bit, you can start asking professors and colleagues for help developing some of these preliminary ideas that you've given a little bit more thought to, and then they can help you refine them or decide to go in a different direction. All right, like with the personal statement, we have a general structure that we think would be helpful to follow. So you may notice here that introduction and background accounts for a lot more than it did in the previous statement. This is because this is where you're going to introduce your question, your problem, and then any other information that's necessary for the reviewers to understand what you're proposing. Without this information, the rest of the plan gets lost and it might not make sense. So we devote more time to the background. We have our research plan, our specific aims, kind of forms the bulk of the proposal. And then we have separate sections for intellectual merit and broader impacts as required by the GRFP. And of course, like the other statements, it should be noted that all these factors tie into one another. So when you write your lit review, kind of implicit in the identification of the knowledge gap is going to be some degree of intellectual merit regarding the novelty and the potential impacts of solving that problem. Likewise, intellectual merit and impact on science is often related to broader impacts. This is 100% okay. You will have designated sections, but there will be overlap, and it naturally should flow that way as well.
Yeah, so first, how do you break up this introduction or background? So the most important thing is that you want here to establish the purpose of the project and give the reviewer any information that they need to understand the problem. Again, don't assume that your reviewer inherently understands why your problem is important or what the field really is. So the first question you want to ask is, what is a problem or knowledge gap you are addressing? Make that very clear. So one example statement would be such like the widespread development and adoption of glycoconjugate vaccines is hindered by their complex production process. Okay, clear what the problem is. Then the next question you want to ask is, why is it important to solve the problem? Okay, you've identified the problem, but why should I care about it? And why should we fund you to solve this problem? So access to therapeutics is limited in the developing world due to complex manufacturing process and resulting high costs. Okay, very concisely, you told them why we need to solve this problem. Now next, how are you going to go about solving it? So what methods, what aims are you going to use to address this problem? And one way to structure this is, for the first time, I will combine approaches usually reserved for X and Y to demonstrate further applicability for your problem. So now it's very clear what you're going to do and how you will do it. So more breaking down this, the introduction paragraph, probably 1 or 2 paragraphs is, so first start off with, again, why is this research relevant and interesting? So the introduction, again, you don't want to assume your reviewer knows everything. So you're going to start broadly to bring them into your field. And then throughout that introduction, you're going to focus down to what your central hypothesis is. So you bring them into your field, tell them why this is interesting, then what that problem or knowledge gap is, and provide only the necessary background. This is really hard to do sometimes because you do have to read a lot to figure out what it is that you don't know. And you want to tell everyone about all this amazing science that you've read and now you know about. And there's so many applicabilities and so many problems, but you really want to stay focused so that your viewer doesn't get distracted by all the other science that you're excited about, but just the science relevant to your problem and knowledge gap. So only include the supporting info and literature review that's important for your problem, for them to understand what this problem is. And then bring them back to your central hypothesis. So what is this testable project, and make sure that it's a feasible PhD project, right? You don't want to propose something that could take 20 years potentially to solve, but the reviewers are keeping in mind that you have 5 to 7 years in a PhD. So what can you achievably solve in those 5 to 7 years? And if you have the space, include the key project details. So the methods you're going to use or the aims you're going to go about solving them. You do have more space to do this in your aims, but if you can do this in your introduction, then the reader is more prepared to follow your aims.
Yeah, with the key details, this could include some of the aspects related to the merit criteria that were mentioned earlier. So if there's a specific professor that you're going to be working with, any equipment, super special equipment that you do have access to that you might want to use, or previous experience with certain techniques. So those little elements that help tie into the feasibility of the project. You can drop those at the end of the introduction, or you can weave them into the aims if it's easier and it makes more sense as you're introducing some of the techniques that you might use.
Thanks. Yeah, so, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, this is just a reminder of the review criteria that the reviewer is looking for in your research statement. So how well qualified are you and your PI? Do you have the background? Do you have the knowledge? Do you have access to all the resources for all these experiments you're proposing? They're really making sure of that in your proposal. So now we'll jump into an introduction. So I'll just give us all a couple of minutes to read through this example introduction, and then we'll go through the different parts. Okay, hopefully you've got a chance to get through most of the statement. I'm just gonna jump in. So in the first couple of sentences, you can already tell that you don't really have to be an expert to understand why this problem is interesting. So yeah, they're just talking about fear, or like natural sense of fear. So this is a broad statement of the field, easy to understand, catches your attention. And then through that paragraph, then they start talking about what the knowledge gap is. So these factors strongly imply a genetic origin of these fears, though none has yet been investigated. So interesting fields, and now what's the knowledge gap? So then they start going into their necessary background. So this is going to be more specific to their fields, bringing the reviewer, narrowing down for the reviewer what the problem is that they're addressing. So here they start defining what the cortical amygdala is and these different areas of the brain. Again, only introducing the areas of the brain that they need to explain their problem to the reviewer. Then as they go through their necessary background, they're slowly bringing you down to why it's important to study this, and then what their hypothesis is. So I propose to identify the first set of marker genes for neurons controlling innate aversive response to a set of specific stereotyped odors. So here they've boldly stated their knowledge gap and their project. So you know exactly what they're investigating and why it's important.
Whoops, I was muted.
Okay.
So now that we've set the stage for our proposal, what question do we have? We're going to go into the research plan. This kind of comprises the bulk of the statement. And ideally in the introduction, you will have identified what specific question you're trying to answer and advanced a hypothesis. I will say as an aside, often it's helpful to advance a central hypothesis for the proposal within the introduction, or even in its own section. If you look at the research proposal example number 1, there's a whole separate section for the hypothesis and introduction of aims. It is also okay to introduce a hypothesis somewhere in the aims if it flows a lot better and is maybe related to a certain type of measurement that you're going to make. That is okay, but you should advance a testable hypothesis at least somewhere in the proposal. If not in the introduction, then in the research plan. So the main goal of this section is, how are you going to test the hypothesis or answer your question? You can do this by introducing 3 specific aims. And now I'm going to go through what are the key components of a specific aim. And if you want to follow along with the example, I'm using research proposal number 1's aim 1.2, which is right at the bottom of the first page of research proposal number 1. So the first part is the specific aim, the intro, the title. It should be descriptive. It should communicate what you are trying to accomplish. So in this example, in the introduction, they've described this vaccine manufacturing platform, and the goal of this aim is to use it to achieve cell-free glycosylation. And this is something that hasn't been accomplished before. So it's very clear what the purpose of the aim is. You do want to avoid really vague aim titles. Next component is the methods. So we have this goal that we're trying to achieve with the aim. If there's any really specific background information that you need to describe within the aim, you can do that right at the beginning. And then we go into the whole experimental protocol. So in this example, they start out by just describing the main components of a glycosylation reaction, and then go into the process. So here we see some experimental techniques, and these are important. Your reviewers will be looking at these to make sure that they're valid to accomplish whatever you've set out to accomplish. So you want to make sure here that you are being technically correct, and that these methods are a feasible workflow for how you might go about this. So this example, transforming something with a plasmid, you're using FPLC for purification, and then you're going to use a Western blot. So take us through the workflow of how you're going to achieve what you set out in the aim, and describe those experimental techniques. However, you don't need to include so much detail about the design of each experiment unless it's really specific. So you don't need to say, I'm going to use this or that as a control, and I'm going to test at 10 different temperatures, and here are all the different temperatures that I'm going to test at, for example. That is too broad and you're using up space. And it doesn't really say as much about your ability to think like a scientist as the broad overview of the methods. Also, your reviewers are probably tired from reading a lot of proposals. They want something that's going to flow and make sense to them experimentally, that they don't have to think too hard about. Just kind of key here. The next component after you've gone through the experimental workflow is any anticipated results or objectives that you have. So if this aim is successful, what do you expect to see? And if you can describe this in terms of some of the methods that you've used, this is really helpful. So if you're making a certain measurement, if you're doing a Western blot, well, what do you expect to see if this was successful, for example? So in this example, it's a little bit hidden within the description, but where they discuss the Western blot, they mentioned detecting a molecular weight increase, which would identify that glycosylation has occurred. So this is an example of an anticipated result that you have to show that you've been successful. What is the objective? This is a really important component. It shows that you're not just shooting in the dark, that you actually know what you're looking for, and you've designed an experimental workflow to get that measurement or result. And lastly, alternatives. You don't need to include these for every single aim, but you do want to include some in the proposal, just to show that you're thinking about things that might go wrong and other techniques that you could use in the event that things don't go according to plan. So right, for this example, they were using Western blotting, but in the case that if for some reason it wasn't really, you weren't really able to detect a substantial difference with the gel, then you might go ahead and use mass spectrometry was the alternative technique that was provided. So maybe a little bit more intensive than a Western blot, but it's not like you have to throw in the towel on your experiment because you don't have a way now of detecting whether or not you were successful. And this relates back to one of the merit review criteria. So the general one regarding the research plan. So, well-reasoned based on a sound rationale. And as mentioned before with the benchmarks and the alternatives, are there metrics or a mechanism to assess success? That's what we just talked about. So again, writing a specific aim, we have 4 components. We have a title, methods, anticipated results and objectives, and alternatives. It should be noted that while these do form the major basis of the specific aim, you don't have to include all of them all the time, whether that's because it's not necessary. For example, you don't need an alternative for every single technique, or perhaps some of this information is elsewhere in the proposal and it wouldn't be useful for you to repeat it. That is completely okay. So here we have 2 examples. These are examples from very short aims, which we've included for brevity, just for ease in this proposal. These were from proposals that had 4 distinct aims. Usually the aims will be a little bit longer, but we should go through and read them now independently and start thinking about how these conform to the structure that we've mentioned here. If you can pick out any areas that seem to match up, or anything that seems missing, and why you think that it might be missing, as well as something to consider. So let's just take 30 seconds to read it over. And if there are any comments or observations from this, we can type them in type them in the chat rather than the Q&A if that's possible. Okay, if anyone wants to just contribute any observations from the aims related to the 4 criteria or to anything else, feel free to type it in the chat. Let's take a quick break for questions right now as we're about halfway through the second part before we discuss the intellectual merit and broader impacts.
Sure, yeah, I can. So there's one question from Sandra. What tips can you give those who are applying at the same time we are applying to graduate school when talking about the qualifications of the PI when we don't know where we will be and who will be our PI?
Yeah, that's totally okay, and you can just leave it out. You don't have to speak about it, and I wouldn't necessarily speak about it unless something about it particularly stands out to enhance your proposal. So if everything that you're trying to do can be accomplished, like say you're a wet lab researcher, what you're trying to do can be accomplished through, basic wet lab equipment, don't bother mentioning it. Same thing if you don't know your professor. I would only go ahead and mention those things if there's really specialized equipment that you would need to use that you'll have access to that kind of helps support the feasibility, or if maybe you're working in like a fairly niche area of research, but you happen to be working for someone who's really established and knowledgeable in that field. Those would be examples of when you would want to include that information, but if it doesn't add anything to really strengthen the proposal, then you definitely don't need to mention it, and especially don't waste space on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. You probably want to talk about the research. You can base a proposal off research you are currently doing or have done also. But that you don't necessarily have to talk about a completely new lab that you are not familiar with. We had one question in the chat. Why 3 aims? Oh, sorry, from Emily. Why 3 aims? Is 2 aims with sub-aims less desirable, or is it how the aims are organized?
Yeah, you should organize the aims in a way that makes the most sense to you. 3 seems to be pretty standard, although actually the 2 examples that we provided, one has 2 aims with 2 sub-aims each, and then the other has 4 aims. It really depends on your project and what makes sense to you in terms of the structure, but I think it ends up that most projects and have 3 aims, but definitely don't let that limit you in terms of how you feel is best to organize your proposal.
All right, I think we can take one more question and then move on. We have a question that just came in. Should we choose a research topic related to what we want to do in graduate school, or what about a topic that we explored as an undergrad for those switching fields preference? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a really interesting risk-benefit question. So you want to weigh the risks and the benefits of doing so. I can give a personal example. So I applied as a first-year graduate student, and I didn't change my major research field. I was biomedical engineering undergrad and also as a grad student. But I did change my subfield to something that was quite different. And I did write a proposal based on that. So I did not write a proposal that was based on my undergrad research. And when I was writing that proposal here, I did not yet have a PI. So I didn't have a PI from my current institution, write me a recommendation or anything. And I sort of I went rogue in a way. I wrote a proposal on a topic that was quite foreign to me, but I still, discussed it with people who were knowledgeable and got feedback. And it worked out okay. So as long as you feel like you can get the feedback that you need on the experimental techniques, I would say it is okay if you know that you'll have resources, whether could be at your current institution, another professor or someone else who works in that field who can give you that feedback. It should be okay. It's also a really fun learning exercise to start exploring research questions in a new field that's really interesting to you. It's exciting. It's a great intellectual opportunity as well. So I wouldn't let that discourage you. I guess it depends on your timeline and who is available to you to provide feedback. So if you start writing this proposal and you're, really questioning whether or not this workflow makes sense, but you feel really confident in your previous research, perhaps, but also if you spend a lot of time in the personal statement, talking about how you're so excited about this new field of research and that's what you want to do, but then your proposal is not related to that, that might also raise an eyebrow. So there's no perfect answer. It's a risk-benefit balance, just depending on the resources that you might have. Do you guys have anything to add?
I think we can all learn from this, you know, from Morgan, really a successful, you know, NSF-GRFP fellow, right? And so we actually, that's a great question, whoever asked it, because I think that this is a concern that so many of us, you know, has, right? Especially for senior undergrads, you know, going to grad school, or those who are first years, right, applying, and it's always, there's that risk. But then, yeah, but Morgan has perfectly, you know, explained it that it is okay. It's just getting the right feedback from the appropriate people. So always seek out, right, people to read over your statements. And yeah, thank you for that. Thank you, Morgan.
Awesome. All right, let's continue. We're wrapping up now with the last portion of the proposal. So a couple more tips for the research plan, just to wrap that section up. And you know, we've touched on a couple of these. So some previous experience with the methods or preliminary data are helpful, but not necessary. If you are a second-year graduate student, having preliminary data can be very helpful for you. And because you're being compared to your cohort, you know, do keep in mind that, you know, others who you're competing with will be submitting, you know, some more detailed proposals with, you know, preliminary data. Figures, we haven't talked about figures yet. Figures are super helpful. Include them where applicable, especially to explain something that's a more complicated process or device. If you have some preliminary data, you can express it as a figure. This will definitely help you save space, and it's just more visually appealing for a reviewer. Sometimes seeing a wall of text is kind of scary. So we would recommend at least one figure within the proposal. As we mentioned before, ask for feedback on your writing, and when you do so, ask someone to just read your proposal point blank and then describe the idea back to you. This will help you find any clear gaps that you might have in your communication. You might think that you're describing one idea, but someone else might get another. This actually happened to me in my NSF-GRFP review, and where one reviewer was, you know, writing some comments on the proposal. And he or she more or less got the idea, but there was something in there that was missing, and I thought, maybe I didn't communicate that as well as I could have. We mentioned this before, mentioned some backup plans, alternative options. This should be somewhere in the proposal without a doubt. It doesn't have to be for every aim, but it is a must. If you'd like, at the end, you can include a brief statement about future directions. So once you do this project, what might be something interesting to investigate in the future. Max 1 sentence, don't spend too much time on it, and then cite any key references that you had. Usually these will be in the introduction, but they can be throughout. I actually don't remember what the font requirement is, and it might have changed, but do check the font requirements on these. And you can kind of squish them in at the bottom in an abbreviated format. Anything that gets the key information across is fine. All right, we're on the home stretch. Now we're on to the intellectual merit. So this section, we've put it in our structure after the research plan, but realistically it can go before or after, depending on what you write about in the introduction. This is okay. So what you want to communicate here is, how is your approach novel or creative, and what new knowledge will it bring to the field? What is the intellectual merit behind this research? So we just have an example here from research statement number 1, which states the intellectual merit really clearly. So describes the contribution to their field. So contribution to the knowledge base in cell-free protein production and demonstrating glycosylation for the first time in this system. And they also mention that in the future, this might allow testing of other proteins and expansion. So this is a great way to describe the intellectual merit of the project. And then from the second research statement example, we have another example of the intellectual merit. So this person did have a designated section, and that's summarized in this first paragraph, where they mentioned how this improves high-power WPT systems, and then again, some future applications. And then also this is kind of formed a succinct concept with information that was actually included in the introduction. So it's completely okay to tie back to other information without necessarily restating it. So from the introduction, they mentioned the challenges that they were trying to address, and in doing so, that shows the intellectual merit of the project as well. So you don't need to worry about repeating yourself too many times. You can assume that some things will be retained, some key concepts will be retained from the introduction as your reviewer goes through and reads your proposal. And finally, broader impacts. The broader impacts that you want to discuss here are more related to your proposal and work that you'll do as a scientist, as opposed to the personal statement, in which we emphasize more about outreach and other activities that might be related less directly to your research work. So what impact will your work have on society? And if it's applicable, how does this tie into what you mentioned in the personal statement? So we have two quick examples here of good broader impact statements that are succinct. So they describe potentially immediate applications of whatever they're proposing without pushing out too far. So for example, whatever you do in your research is probably not going to solve world hunger, for example. But if your research is related to, I don't know, crop production, soil, you can describe kind of the immediate next step application of your research so that it's realistic. So this person describes how their research might lead to an efficient and reliable increase in range of EVs. And in the beginning, they mentioned how this is important for eventually addressing climate change, but they boil it down to what they've done in their proposal. Same thing for the bottom one. So this person talked about at first their improvements on this vaccine platform, and then they say, oh, well, at the end of the day, this eliminates cold chain manufacturing requirements, so you could think about, shipping elsewhere where, the infrastructure may not exist to produce these types of vaccines. That's a reasonable application. Might not happen immediately with their research, but it's absolutely, a contribution to that field. One don't for the broader impacts is don't provide vague suggestions that are not supported by information in the personal statement. So this is as it relates to your outreach, science communication, and other activities. So we have two examples here, both from these same funded examples of what not to do. So you could read those really quickly. The first one's about presenting findings to the public. The second one is about using the technology as a teaching tool. These both seem like great ideas, but the first is quite vague. Most of us, as we go through our research careers, will go on to publish our research and present it. There's nothing really novel about this statement. And it sounds like this person's reaching for something to say about impact that doesn't have to do with the science. Second one, also a great idea and probably quite applicable. But if it's not backed by any statements about a desire to engage in this type of activity, any mentorship experience, again, it sounds like you're reaching for something to say. So try to avoid these types of statements unless you have a really clear motivation that you've already described previously in your personal statement.
Okay, then we'll just go over some general tips for how to write this thing. So very important, keep a record of all your drafts. You're probably going to have various numbers of drafts as you develop your ideas and you go through different feedback revisions. So save all of them to make sure that you know what you changed. And also because when you look back, it's a really great example of how your writing progressed, and you can learn a lot from that. Just be aware your first drafts, they're not going to be great, and everyone starts out this way. As you write and you think and you reflect, your ideas become more clear. Again, there are really hard page limits, but don't worry about that in the beginning. Just put everything on paper, write everything out that you want to write, and then it's easier to trim that out later to fit the page limit. And know what your writing process is. Everyone has their preferences or their preferred way of writing. Do you need background noise? Do you need an absolutely quiet space? And just be aware of what you need in order to get your work done. And another important tip I can give you is to really just block out time in your schedule to writing, because it's hard to just find the time to write or find the time to work on the statement. If you put it in your schedule and it's there, you're more likely to actually sit down and work on your statement. Then a few more feedback tips. So really important, get various people to read your statements, and different types of people. So a PI, maybe a fellowship manager at your school. Do you have a writing center? The NSF makes it publicly available who won the award and what school they're at. So just look at who the past awardees are. Is anyone in your department or a school that you know, and reach out to them? Because I definitely had reached out to other people that I just saw were listed at my school that won the award. And I was like, hey, can you read my statement? And they were like, of course. I had other people read my statements. So it's always like a giving back situation. About 4 people is a good number. When you start going over 5, you start realizing that you can't satisfy everyone's wants for your statements, and you don't want it to become too generalized. You want to keep your personal voice and your personal tone in both statements. For the people that you do get feedback from, have them track changes in the Word document so you don't forget what their comments are. It's also easier probably to talk on the phone over Zoom, over some maybe jargon that you use that's going to be easier to talk about right then and there than going back and forth between different emails. Or maybe an experience that they want you to clarify. It's going to be easier to say that out loud. And again, these reviewers are going to help easily see any jargon or language that is not common, that maybe because you've been involved in certain research experiences, it's very second nature to you, and you might not realize that it's not second nature to everyone. So this is also important feedback you'll get from reviewers. And yeah, from the people you ask feedback for, because you have to remember that reviewers, they're going to be reading multiple applications. So you're going to appreciate when you keep things concise and clear, so that they really understand what you're saying. Because if they can't understand you, then they can't score you properly, and that's going to count against you. Then I think finally we have a quick summary of everything that you need and why it's important. So your personal statement, this is why are you a scientist? What experience do you have that have led you to where you are now? And what your dedication is to improving the scientific community. Then your research statement, again, what is this achievable plan that's bridging this knowledge gap? And how are your aims showing that you can think like a scientist? Your transcript is important because they want to see that you have the background that you are going to do the work in, especially as a second-year graduate student. You should have taken classes that are specific to that research plan that you're proposing. Letters of recommendation. So other scientists that can talk about you as a scientist is a really amazing endorsement. So the letters of recommendation are going to be the people that believe in you, that have seen your work as a researcher or as a part of the scientific community. Then your list of honors, any engagement, any awards that you receive, engagement with the community, also shows how active you are, or any publications that you can't mention in your statements. This is also the place to put them. And yeah, now we'll answer any questions. So
Thank you, Cathy and Morgan. Yeah, so for the questions, we see a lot of them, and we're running a little bit over time. So if we do not address your questions, please feel free to message any one of us on our Slack channel, and also email the general cientificolatino@gmail.com. But I think we'll first start off with a question that was asked in the chat box, also from Emily Poole. They asked, so could you then label the first portion within the research plan statement as introduction and intellectual merit, just as a way to integrate and also increase the flow?
Yeah, I would say definitely. If you think the bulk of what you want to communicate about the intellectual merit is sort of implicit in the way that you're doing your literature review and describing your problem, and maybe a generalized summary of your approach, you absolutely can do that as long as you call it out very clearly in the statement title, and then maybe using some bold or underline statements to really emphasize intellectual merit. The one thing that I will say, and I'm not sure how much this matters, is you have someone who's reading through these applications maybe a little bit quickly. They're probably going to remember the beginning and the end the most. So if you could end by reiterating the intellectual merit, that might help you a little bit. Not because putting it at the beginning is inherently, a less effective way to communicate, just because of human nature in this process that we're in. So absolutely you can do it that way. And I'm sure there are plenty of examples that do it that way. Maybe consider including something about it at the end, even if it's just a statement, possibly even within the broader impacts that you bolded or something to like refocus the reviewer's attention to the intellectual merit and broader impacts, because when they write down that score at the end of the day, that's what they're scoring.
Awesome. Thank you for that question, Emily, and thank you, Morgan. Another good question that was answered a bit ago is regarding the figures. So can you include your own figure, or can I use one from a paper so long as I cite it?
I would not encourage citing papers figures. This is supposed to be your works, your novel research proposals, so you should take the time to make your own. You can definitely be inspired by an existing paper figure, but it's more of an initiative if you make your own figure, I think. Especially if you're a first or second year graduate student, you're already in grad school, you should have the kind of the wanting to make your own figure. As an undergrad, it can be a little more intimidating, but reach out for help from your lab members who probably have experience making figures, or from your PI who has a lot of experience making figures that can give you tips on what best to do.
Yeah, and if you don't have data, a schematic is usually the best way to communicate, your experimental process or something like that. If you look at the two examples we provided, each has one figure that's a schematic, and this is quite common for their proposals as well. And for those, you can use PowerPoint, you can use Illustrator, and all kinds of interesting programs. If you're in biology, BioRender is a really great tool to make really nice professional looking figures, and it's not a super intensive process like using Illustrator or something of that nature.
For sure, thank you. Alrighty, so I think let's just two more questions, and the second one being I'm grouping some together because I see a lot of related questions. And so someone has asked, my proposed research project is closing, or bridging a knowledge gap in neuroscience, but it's not related to disease or anything. How can I convince my project that so that I can make an impact on society if all it will bring is more knowledge about particular touch circuit that I am interested in? I think a touch circuit is something that's more niche to neuroscience, but I think I believe the question addresses the broader impacts section. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think the one example that we show that was like biology related was related to therapeutic development. It absolutely, if you're doing biology research, does not have to be directly related to therapeutic development or patient care or anything of the sort. And in a way, with the biomedical engineering proposals, they discourage any type of work that involves, like in vivo therapeutic studies, something like that. So you're absolutely on the right track. I think the reviewers do try to focus on, what are the, the intellectual contributions. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. In terms of the broader impacts, you can absolutely frame it in terms of the broader impacts on your field. So once you understand more about this circuit, or sorry, I can't remember exactly what it was that you were studying.
Circuit, yeah.
So, so what new knowledge will this bring? And then how will this frame future studies? That's a broader impact on the field at the very least, even if it's not directly helping a patient yet. how will that understanding inform future work? I think if you take that angle, you know, it's completely valid.
For sure. Thank you for that question. So we're going to take one more, and I realize there are several questions that we haven't addressed. Please, again, please use our Slack community. The whole reason why you're in our GSMI is because we're here to help you, right? And so just because of the interest of time, and so we're going to take one more question. So this question was asked a while ago, and so someone has asked, it seems like the way the fellowship requirements and is set up, I'm encouraged to follow a formula in writing my statement. So I guess what is your advice, right? How can my application stand out?
Yeah, the formula is there more to help the reviewers, but we know the reviewers are looking for what the reviewers are going to be looking for. So you want to make sure you check those boxes because that's how they're going to be able to score you, right? Did you answer the broader impacts, intellectual merit? How can your application stand out? Well, that's again, an introduction. So what's your unique research experience and the tone you use, the language you use to discuss your research experience, that will bring to life how you feel about science. So your excitement, your enthusiasm, your dedication, that's how you'll be able to stand out.
Yeah. I was gonna say, yeah, they're very particular about what they're looking for, and like in terms of the formatting, in terms of everything. And like Cathy said, you do want to check all those boxes. The information that we've presented here in terms of the structure blocks for each of the statements, how do you want to structure a specific aim? We're trying to provide this information to help you think about all of that key information and sort of how to compartmentalize it so it's easier for you to write and so you don't miss anything. However, do not need to follow that structure at all. You can rearrange where things go. You don't need to include all of the components for all the aims. If it makes more sense to put one component before the other for your application, absolutely go ahead and do so. We're just trying to provide a framework to help you, make sure that you don't lose any of that information and communicate it in a way that does flow, especially in the case of the personal statement and telling your story.
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you. That question was a great way to also end this workshop. So Morgan and Cathy gave us a wealth of information, right? And so, but don't worry, so this will be available as a PDF under the webinar section in the GSMI members area. And the information of accessing the GSMI members area has been emailed to you from the cientificolatino@gmail.com account and also in our Slack channel as well. But this webinar, right, is being recorded, and so it will eventually be uploaded online with closed captioning, and so you are able to go back to any point within this webinar in case you want to go back to something, right? But yeah, so thank you so much for spending the evening or the afternoon, wherever you guys are, with us. And so thank you, Cathy and Morgan, for shedding light on all of this. So yeah, but stay tuned. They will be doing something very special right after this webinar as well. So yeah. Alrighty. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Stacy. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.